happy pajama day. So I hope you are excited about doing your history in pajamas. I have my pajamas on. Okay. And so I know some of you might be always doing your work in pajamas, which really isn't good for you to do because your brain doesn't like wake up. So that's why it's supposed to be a special day today for pajamas. All right. So we're going to continue in the Civil War. We're looking at page 153 to 155. And what we're going to do today is basically we're changing gears. We're leaving the battlefield and we're going back to the home front. They always call it the home front, where, you know, the people are living, yes? And we're going to be looking at what life is like for the people back home, for the people in the South and the North who are back home. So it's called Life During War. Okay, we're going to look at the politics. We're going to look at the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to look at what people think, what happened, not on the battlefield anymore for today, but back at home where everybody's like hanging out and waiting for, you know, the war to be over. All right, so one huge change that occurs at this time in history is that women and children and older men who can't go off to war, they are all working in the fields and the factories as the men go off to war. Now, this is something that will continue to repeat itself. I didn't know if I told you my back is kind of bugging me, so I'm going to sit now. This will continue to repeat itself every time there's a war from here on out. So during the World War I, same thing happened. The women left the home and they went and worked in the factories and in the fields to help out during the war effort. It happened in World War II, and in World War II there was a lot of propaganda to get women to do this, and that's where a famous poster of Rosie the Riveter came out, and they actually had like advertisements in the movie theaters going, hey, do your part. And my grandma, yeah, she made cots during World War II. So that is the question for today. What did Mrs. Johnson's grandma do? Now that doesn't mean you shut off the video and you go do whatever, because there'll be a secret message later too, secret word, yeah? All right, so what did Mrs. Johnson's grandma do during World War II? She made cots, army cots, all right? So that's what's happening. So a lot of the slaves end up fleeing from their masters as war breaks out, which means a lot of southern plantations don't have as many people to work. The men are off to war, so the women and children are out in the fields trying to plant and harvest, okay? In the North, a lot of the men go off to war and the women go into the factories and they go into ammunition places where they, you know, make ammunition factories, and they have a huge part in making the weaponry and the uniforms and all those things. Same in the South, it's just they don't have as many factories in the South. So the same thing is happening in both parts of the country. All right, so let's continue. So the North was able to raise enough food for soldiers, the civilians in the North, and to sell to Europe. So that gave the North an extra revenue, and that helped the North to make sure everybody had food, okay? So it's pretty cool. Because again, their economy wasn't based on slaves, so they kind of already had machinery, okay, to help. Remember we talked about the inventions that they had, the reaper and the steel plow and those things. Remember that at the beginning of the year? So those things are being utilized to help them as they are having to do the fields without the men, without the slaves. All right, does that make sense? Okay. Northern factories, okay, supplies. Northern factories were super busy. They were making uniforms and boots and bullets and guns and the hats and clothes for civilian people. Because remember, yes, you have to clothe your military, but you still have to clothe the people as well. At this time in history, a lot of civilian people made their own clothes, but you still had to make the cloth so that they could, oh, excuse me, make their own clothes. All right. Okay. In the North at this time, remember I've told you that war brings on new inventions, new ways of doing things that help everybody. So since they're trying to figure out how to make more uniforms, how to do it better, what ends up happening is that they develop a new sewing machine. A sewing machine that is so much better than anything they've ever had. It allows the women to be able to sew the uniforms for the soldiers in a quicker way. Okay. All right. And I already told you they were ammunition factories. Okay, so the same is true for the South. The South is trying to do the same thing, but they don't have as many resources. Because remember, first of all, they don't have as many people, right? The North has 22 million people at this time in history, and the South only has 9 million people at this time in history. So that's one of the issues. They don't have as many factories. That's another issue. Women in factories got lower wages, and some of that may be because they tended to be slower. They weren't as accurate. That means they weren't as good at their job. Okay, and they had less experience, which is why they were slower and not as good at their job. Because with experience comes a quickness and a more precise way of doing things. Okay. So when you first learned to tie your shoes, you were really slow at it. You had one lace. Maybe mommy taught you bunny ears. That's what I taught my kids. Maybe the loop and the around, and you know, it just depends. But it took you a long time. But now you tie your shoes without even thinking about it. Okay? So same kind of idea with everything that you learn how to do. All right. So in the South, there were a lot more hardships. The South had a tough time. Like I said, first of all, they had less people. They had 9 million versus 22 million. That is a huge difference. And what happens is the slaves start leaving, which I already talked about. But not only that, remember one of the advantages we talked about was that the South is fighting in their own land, in their own part of the country. But that was actually not 100% advantage, because most of these battles took place in fertile fields. So a fertile field is a field that you use for planting, for farming. So they would be trampling all over the little baby plants that were trying to go. They might destroy an entire crop of corn, or whatever other food that they're growing, potatoes or whatever, by the battle that's occurring in the field. So their whole crop might be destroyed by a battle in the field. Even if they didn't have a battle in your field, you might be walking across somebody's farm, somebody's field, and again trampling down those little baby growing up plants. And once you trample them down, they're dead. They just lay there in the ground. And they can't photosynthesize, because basically you've cut off all of the tubing that's inside the stem. Remember we talked about that in 3rd grade, the phylum and phloem, yeah, in there, and they won't come back. Okay, so they had a terrible time with food, because that's where the war was, in the fields where the food was supposed to be growing. Okay. And at first, when the war very first began and everybody thought it was going to be quick, the slaves stayed and worked the fields. But when it became obvious that this war was going to take a long time, they skedaddled, which means ran away, took off, most of them to try to join the Union or the Union Army. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to read it. Glasses would help. Disrupted the South's economy. Okay. So I talked about that. Okay, so another issue that they had was transportation disruption. Okay, remember the Union, their whole goal in life is to destroy the transportation, the movement of goods and troops. And so with that disruption though, with moving soldiers and weapons, it also destroyed the ability to move food and supplies for civilians as well. So you would not necessarily get that shipment of cloth that you were waiting for as a store owner. So then you could not sell it to the people who lived where you are because there was no cloth, because everybody along the way they couldn't get over the railroads, or they couldn't get up the Mississippi, or they couldn't get. So that really disrupted the life of the Southern civilians as well. It disrupted the food supply, and many of the South, as the war went on, suffered from food shortages. Okay, another hardship for the South was they had a lot less factories. And remember, we've always talked about this war, you need a lot of stuff. You need tents and cots and blankets and uniforms and shoes and weapons and ammunition. So weapons are like guns and cannons, okay? Ammunition is like the bullets and the cannonballs. So, and they had like, as the war went on, they developed better weaponry. They had like exploding cannonballs at one point, where it would shoot out and it would explode. And the South, they had a really good, one really good factory that did that. And that factory ended up getting blown up by a woman who wasn't paying attention to safety, and she put fire too close to gunpowder, and the whole thing like going and then after that they built another factory, but the expertise seemed to have been gone. So when they would launch one of these things, it would usually go over top of the entire Union, or it wouldn't even go far enough and it would kill their own people. So something majorly disastrous happened after that factory had exploded. But it was those kinds of things where if in the North one of those factories would have exploded, and maybe it did, I just don't know about it, they had so many others to pick up the slack. In the South, they didn't have that. They had like one, and then they rebuilt one, and then, yeah. So it was really, really tough for them with the factories. The Confederates needed to make their own goods because now they were in war with the Union, because remember, they would just get the stuff from the Union, from the North. They would send cotton up north, and then the North would make it into fabric and send it back south. But now that they're fighting, they're not doing that anymore. So the South had to become self-sufficient very quickly, but it was really hard because of the blockade, because the slaves leaving. So it was a very difficult thing. So civilians had to repair their own clothes. So they would get like a hole. What do you usually do when you get a hole? You usually throw it away, right? But because there was very little of anything, it's a shortage, they had to patch, or it's called darning, where you put in like a little piece and you sew it together underneath. Darning, which kind of brings it back together. Their clothes and their socks and their whatever, their pants. So if you've ever watched the movie Gone with the Wind, she takes curtains down. It's a super famous scene. She takes her curtains off of the window and she makes herself a dress out of the curtains because they don't have any fabric, and she wants to make a good impression. And so that's what Scarlett O'Hara does. So it was, but that was reality. That was, they did not have clothes anymore. They did not have the ability to buy the materials because the South was in a problem because they didn't have as many factories. Paying for the war. Remember, we've talked about war is expensive. You have to pay for people to move. You have to pay for uniforms. You have to pay for them to eat. You have to pay for them to get medicine. You have to pay for them to get paid, because soldiers got paid just like they do today for doing that job. Okay. Plus, you had to supply them with food and water and moving them and tents. And so somehow you have to come up with money to pay for all that stuff. So both the North and the South decided they would just print money. Okay. And so in printing money, they were guaranteeing that people would be able to use that money to purchase goods and services. So in the North, it worked out okay. All right. The issue with printing money is that your money becomes less valuable. So it's a very kind of fine line to do this. But in the North, it worked out okay because everybody trusted the money in the North. They believed that the North would win, and they believed that their money would be worth something. In the South, it did not work as well because some of the Southerners were concerned, and rightfully so, that if the South somehow lost, their money would not be worth the paper it was written on. And that's really what happened. So imagine that today, China comes in, takes over our country, and they say, your US dollars are no good anymore. So basically, no matter how much money you have, it's completely worthless because nobody will let you buy anything with that. Now you have to use a different form of currency. I don't even know what they use in China. We'll just make up a pia. I don't know what that is. I just made it up. So you have to now buy everything with pias, and we don't give you anything for your American dollars. So everybody would then start with absolutely nothing. And you usually say it's not worth the paper it's written on. Does that make sense? So that's what happened. So they had Confederate dollars. Some people bought into Confederate dollars and used Confederate dollars. But the minute the Confederacy dissolved, nobody would accept that as payment for anything. Okay? All right. The other way they paid for the war was they raised taxes. Okay? They told everybody, hey, now you got to pay taxes. This is how we often pay for many things. I'm sure after the coronavirus thing is over, all the taxes are going to go up because they've been spending money like crazy people. So the government doesn't actually do anything to make their own money. They just tax its people. So they raised taxes to pay for the war, which is what happens today, like I said. And the other thing is that they borrowed money. They borrowed money from England and France and Spain, okay? Countries that had money, which guess what? We do today. And guess who we borrow from a lot? China, okay? We owe China tons of money. All right, I don't know who we're borrowing from right now or if we're borrowing. I'm not really sure what we're doing economically in our country. But you can't just like poof, money comes out of the air. Just like your parents don't poof and money comes out of the air. Only God can poof and money comes out of the air. Okay, God can make something out of nothing, but only He can. Nobody else can do that. So it would be like if your parents just stopped going to work and went, where's my money? And there isn't any. Okay, does that make sense? So they are borrowing from others, like we might borrow for a house or a car or something like that, but you got to pay it back, except apparently if you're the government, then you don't. But usually most people have to pay it back. So that is how, these are the three ways that they paid for the war. Politics. The politics in the North and the South were a mess, basically, at this time of history. So in the South, the politics was super confusing. They were a mess. They did not run a government before. Remember, they were part of the United States, which had been established 100 years earlier. Not even 100, like 80. And so they didn't really know the ins and outs of running a government. Jefferson Davis was a great choice because he had been in government before, but it's just one guy, and one guy doesn't know how everything works. Okay? So the Confederacy was having the same issues that the United States, the 13 colonies, had back when they became their own nation. The balance of power, the balance of state power versus federal power, which is again something we're having today. Okay, so President Trump, the federal government, has said the states get to decide if they're quarantined, if they're not, when they open, what they open, blah, blah, blah. And the states are taking on that power, but then there's other states that are going, no, the federal government should decide what we're doing. Okay, so it was the same kind of idea back here. But back here, there was a war going on. Okay, so to have a weak federal government, or you could say Confederate government, to have a weak Confederate government was not helpful in a war effort. Okay, it just, if you're telling the state of Tennessee that they need to send you money to pay for the war, and they go, yeah, no, because remember, that's what happened in the beginning of the United States. Okay, so they're having this issue, and Jefferson Davis has a lot of people who are not really happy with him. So he tried very hard to keep the Confederacy together. So we don't often think of Jefferson Davis, here he is, trying to keep the Confederacy together. We only ever think of Lincoln trying to keep the Union together. But the political landscape of the Confederacy was such that Davis had to try to keep them together. Okay, Davis was accused of having too much power by some of the states. So like maybe Texas, I don't know which state, I'm just using an example, might have said, oh no, we don't want to send you any more money for this war. We just want to keep all our money here. And Davis is like, you got to send me the money. Okay? And so they felt that he had too much power. Those who opposed Davis, though, they didn't like try to put some other person in. They didn't try to have a coup. They didn't try to impeach him. They didn't try any of those things because they knew they were at war. And they knew that that would be detrimental to the war effort and their effort to stay free states away from the Union, the federal government. Okay? But they had plans. They were going to take him out after the war was over, which did happen, but he was like arrested and put in jail after the war was over for treason. Okay? All right. So, in the North, it was much more complicated, the politics. All right? Some of the people in the North thought that the South should be allowed to leave in peace. Remember, we talked about that the other day, that the North and the South both had talked about secession throughout the history of the United States. And some of them did feel that they had the right to secede under Article 10. Okay? Other groups of people in the North opposed the secession but supported slavery. They're like, yeah, they can't leave because we're all together. We're one family and you can't leave our family. But they were okay with slavery. Okay? So that was an issue. So Lincoln's biggest opponent were the Democrats at this time. So some Democrats opposed the war. Some thought secession was legal. Some wanted to fight for the Union but disliked Lincoln and abolitionists. Okay? Because remember, abolitionists are people who are trying to get rid of slavery, and Lincoln just didn't want the slavery to grow. And so some Democrats are like, yeah, let's fight to keep the Union together, but we don't like you. Okay? So it was a confusing time in politics in this time in history. All right? Some feared that the slaves would disrupt the economy. So 2 ways that they were concerned about the slaves disrupting the economy. One was all the slaves leaving from the South, from the slavery, and thusly not having enough farm hands to work the crops. Number 2 was that they would then go looking for other jobs. So one group of people that were very concerned about the second issue was the Irish. Okay, the Irish at this point in history are immigrants. They've come over, and immigrants always start at the bottom. That's kind of how it goes because they don't have a lot of experience. They don't speak English. They're not understanding things, so they tend to start in jobs that they felt would be taken over by the slaves. So they opposed the freeing of the slaves because they were worried they would end up losing their jobs. And that was a legitimate worry, okay? But do you keep people as property because of that? No. All right. So the Republicans were the most supportive of Lincoln, okay? Because remember, the Republicans, they joined the party because they were against slavery. So they were very happy that something might come out of this, that the slaves would be free was their hope. I don't think that they were actually happy about a war because nobody's really happy about a war. War is not good. People are killed, things are destroyed. It's not like a happy way to solve issues, but sometimes it's a necessary way to solve issues. Even in the Bible, God told Israel to go to war sometimes, okay? When they were taking the promised land, Joshua was supposed to go in and he was supposed to take over every place, all right? And some places God just handed him, like Jericho. But Joshua had to obey. Joshua had to march around the city of Jericho with his men for those 7 days. But even God tells people that they need to go to war. So it's not that war is evil, it's that war kind of needs to be like the last resort, but it sometimes is necessary. All right. So during the war. So during the war, Lincoln faced 2 elections. I know you go, what? But remember, we have elections every 2 years for Congress, right? So before the first election, the issue that came up with was the Emancipation Proclamation. So Lincoln was a little worried about signing that due to the fact that he didn't want to lose support. But he felt that he was a strong enough president at that time that he could go ahead and he could sign the Emancipation Proclamation and that he would still maintain control of the House and the Senate, which means there'll still be more Republicans in the House and the Senate than there would be Democrats. That's what it means to keep control. So the Republicans did stay in control of the House of Representatives, okay? And that was in the election of 1862. So remember, he was elected in 1860. We went to war in 1861, and this is 1862. And Congress still has more Republicans than Democrats in it. In 1864, that's the election you think about with Lincoln because that's when he runs as president again against George McClellan. And that is when he is reelected, okay? There was actually someone running in the primary against Lincoln. He wanted to be the Republican candidate and bounce off Lincoln, and his name was Samuel Chase. But the Republicans are like, no, we're going to stay with Lincoln. We need him because we're at war. I don't think they've ever transferred power to a different president during a war. Okay. You want that stability. And so they were like, what are you talking about, Mr. Chase? No, you cannot be the Republican nominee. So McClellan, in the election of 1864, only won 3 states. Okay, only 3 states came his way in the Electoral College, and Abraham Lincoln won all the rest. All right. Remember, these are only the states that didn't secede. The states that seceded would have never voted in this election because they were no longer part of the Union. So it's only the northern states and the border states that did not secede that voted in this election. And out of those states, McClellan won 3. Okay. All right. So in the South, more people were concerned with secession than a strong president. Okay. So again, they're giving Jefferson Davis an issue. But in the North, they believed that Lincoln led them that he would lead them Abraham Lincoln's up here. I'll get him. Hang on. That they would lead him. There he is, Abraham Lincoln. Oh, he got curled. Abraham Lincoln. Okay. That he would lead them to a victory, and that he would be the only one to be able to keep the Union together. And that is why they voted for him again. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation. I know it's going long, and I will try to go quickly through this. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863. It only affected the Confederate States, though. It did not free the slaves in the border states. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware got to keep their slaves. It was only to free the slaves in the southern states, which most southern states said, we're not even in the Union. What do you think you're doing? You can't tell us what to do. So it was kind of like, not as a, it was like the beginning of the end of slavery, but it wasn't like, it was funky, okay? When southern slaves heard about the Emancipation Proclamation, they did start to leave. And so the North hoped that the war would be worth it, because by this point we've been at war for 2 years, and almost 2 years, and people are starting to get weary of war, okay? So it boosted, so the Emancipation Proclamation, it made people like, yes, so this war has been worth it, because they were getting weary of it. We got the emancipation. That means when the Union joins back together, Texas and Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, North Carolina, okay, those places won't be able to have slaves anymore. So they were like, yay! But the South, it really hurted their war effort because, like I said, thousands of slaves fled when they heard about the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm not sure how they heard about it, but they did. Okay, because remember, they can't read, they can't write. It was illegal to teach them. But somehow they did. Okay, it ended all southern hope of Britain coming in to support them, because Britain opposed slavery. So even though like the Emancipation Proclamation was kind of funky, it did have these effects. I don't know if I said that well enough. Black regiments formed. They were not treated equally, though. Okay, so a regiment is a group of men who fight together. So there were black regiments that formed, and I'm going to use that word because that's the word that was used then. African American came later. So that's the historical, accurate word. So what they did was they came together as a group to be a fighting force, but they weren't treated the same as a white group. In fact, they weren't even allowed to like intermingle. And in the beginning, they weren't allowed to fight. They like buried bodies and dug ditches and stuff like that. So they were paid less. They had less medical benefits. They had a higher death toll. It was 37% higher than whites. There were no officers, African American officers. They weren't allowed to be officers. If an African American person, a black person, was caught in a battle and he was wearing a Union uniform, he was either immediately killed or enslaved. And usually they went for the killing thing. They did not take black prisoners. They did not take African Americans as prisoners. They did not do it. So more than 190,000 blacks fought on the Union side. There was an upside to this, though. Once they got to fight, people saw that they were intelligent. They saw that they were brave. They saw they were useful, that they were on equal footing as white people. Duh. You know, sometimes we read history and we go, what are you thinking? Of course they are. They are created in the image of God just like you and me. I don't understand the problem. I really don't. There's one race, guys. Human race. That's it. That's it. So it's just, I don't know. People think weird things. So this did help them in that way. They did talk, though, about sending the African American people back to Africa. Actually, they even got a colony in Africa to send them back after the war. Okay, but they didn't want to go back, so that didn't really work the way they were thinking it would. You know, it's like they're sending them back home, but if you've lived here all your life, that's not really home anymore. Does that make sense? All right, so the Confederate Army, the Congress blocked allowing African American slaves, previous slaves, to come in and fight. The Congress was worried about that. So eventually, the amount of men there are to fight, because they go like down to boys, like I think they were letting people at 11 come in as soldiers, white people. And so finally they're like, okay, fine, we'll go ahead and we will let slaves come in as Confederate soldiers. So they had a bunch of them. That was in March of 1865. And they had 300,000. It just boggles my mind, because you're a slave and then you're going to fight for the people who want to keep you as slaves. I don't understand it. But anyway, this is what happened. So 300,000 joined up to fight for the Confederacy. I do know they were promised their freedom if the Confederacy won, which is also kind of silly because they already had their freedom technically because of the Emancipation Proclamation, but this is how these things go. So they actually never got to fight for the Confederacy due to the fact that the war ended. Okay, this was March. When did the war end? April. April of 1865 is when the war ended. So they let them enlist in March of 1865. And they all joined up and they got their uniforms, but you have to be trained. They don't just even today, they don't just say, oh, hey, I'm going to be in the military. And they grab you and go, okay, off you go. They train you. They started training them maybe, but that was about it. Okay? Because April of 1865, what happens? In a city called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Lee surrenders to Grant. Okay, so we're a month away from that. All right, and that is the beginning of the end of the Civil War. All right, so that is your lesson for today. And I meant to say it when I was doing Emancipation Proclamation. That's your secret password, Emancipation Proclamation. All right, I meant to do it like in the middle and I forgot. All right, so I'll see you tomorrow. Not in jammies, right? Not a jammy day. All right, bye guys.